He was 10 years old when the numbers began. At first they appeared as idle doodles in the margins of his school notebooks, digits scrawled without context, without reason. His classmates saw them as nonsense. His teacher thought they were distractions. But the boy, he kept writing page after page, always numbers. No one asked where they came from. He didn't offer an explanation, and when questioned, he simply shrugged. To him, they weren't strange. They were just there, as if whispered by something invisible, something that wasn't supposed to be heard. It was a rainy Tuesday when the pattern caught the teacher's eye. A familiar sequence of numbers repeated in different variations, too specific to ignore. Out of curiosity, or perhaps intuition, he entered them into an online map. He expected a blank field, a random location. What he found was far more unsettling. The coordinates pointed to a wooded area, miles from town. An area that had once been the center of a quiet search. Years ago, someone had gone missing there. The case had gone cold. The news had faded. But somehow, this boy, who hadn't even been born when it happened, had drawn a line straight to it. The teacher didn't sleep that night. He stayed awake, scrolling through old articles, trying to convince himself it was just a coincidence. But the deeper he looked, the more the pieces started to connect. The numbers matched timelines, the locations aligned, and the boy kept writing. There was something haunting about his calm, as if he wasn't guessing, but remembering, as if the information came not from books or stories, but from somewhere else, somewhere that couldn't be explained in rational terms. Was it a gift, a subconscious link, or something even harder to define? The town had no answers. The authorities didn't know what to make of it, but someone had to follow the trail. Someone had to ask the questions others were too afraid to ask, because the boy wasn't done. He had more numbers, more pages, and each one might unlock a piece of a puzzle long buried in silence. This is the story of the boy who spoke in coordinates and the secrets he never meant to tell. The classroom had always been a place of quiet routines, the kind of space where each day mirrored the one before. But ever since the numbers appeared, something had shifted. The teacher, Miss Lorne, began watching the boy more closely. His name was Eli. He sat in the back, near the window, and barely spoke unless called upon. But now, her eyes kept returning to his hands, constantly scribbling. The numbers weren't part of any assignment. They weren't equations or notes. They drifted along the margins, down the back of worksheets, sometimes etched into the cover of his notebooks. At first, Miss Lorne thought it was just a distraction, something kids did to pass the time, but there was order in the chaos, repetition, patterns, precision, and something about them unsettled her. One afternoon, while Eli was in the library, she picked up one of his discarded sheets. A long column of numbers filled the page. She didn't recognize what they meant, but the length and format reminded her of something she'd seen before: longitude and latitude. Almost jokingly, she typed a set into a map app on her phone. When the map loaded, her hands froze. The location was real, a stretch of forest several miles outside town. Remote, quiet, unremarkable, except for the memory it carried. That place had once been part of a quiet search, years ago. A teenager had gone missing after walking home from a summer bonfire. Her name was Ava. Flyers had gone up. Local volunteers combed the woods. But she was never found. And over time, her name faded into the silence that follows when answers don't come. Miss Lorne stared at the map, a tightness growing in her chest. Eli wasn't from this area originally. His family had moved to town only 3 years earlier. There was no way he could have heard about Ava. The case wasn't something people talked about anymore. It wasn't taught in schools. It had become one of those unspoken stories buried in the town's collective memory. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, wondering if she should say something, if she was overreacting. But a part of her knew this wasn't random, and Eli wasn't just playing with numbers. What would you do if a child pointed, without knowing, to the exact spot where a mystery had gone quiet? Miss Lorne returned to school the next morning with a quiet urgency. She greeted the students as usual, trying to mask the weight of what she had discovered. Eli walked in with his backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes calm, unreadable. He sat down, pulled out a notebook, and without hesitation began writing again. She couldn't help but glance his way throughout the day. During recess, while the other students played outside, she stayed behind and opened the drawer where she kept ungraded papers. Eli had turned in a worksheet the day before, and on the back of it, more numbers, different from the ones she had checked, more coordinates. She copied them onto a sticky note and waited until her lunch break. Alone in the staff room, she pulled out her phone and entered the new set. Another location appeared, this one a stretch of rural road about 30 minutes away near an abandoned gas station. She felt the same chill rise in her spine. She'd passed that road many times but never thought much of it, until she remembered a detail. Another case, not as widely known as Ava's. A local man had disappeared after his car broke down along that very route. His name was never released publicly, but Miss Lorne remembered the whispers. People said he was troubled, maybe he had left on his own. No search had ever been organized. The case faded before it really began. Could it be that Eli's numbers were pointing to more than one place? More than one story? If so, how? That evening, she pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began listing every sequence of numbers she'd seen Eli write in the past weeks. From memory, from scraps of worksheets, from the sides of tests, she organized them line by line, and when she compared them to satellite maps, a strange pattern began to form. Dots scattered across the region, each one near a place tied to something unresolved. She looked at the paper, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't a game. But what haunted her more was the question she hadn't dared to ask. Was Eli trying to reveal something? Or was he simply a vessel for something much older than himself? The next Saturday, unable to bear the weight of uncertainty, Miss Lorne made a decision she had never imagined herself making. She got in her car and drove to the first location, the one buried deep in the woods, tied to Ava's disappearance. She didn't tell anyone, not the school, not her family. It wasn't official. It wasn't even rational. But something in her heart told her she had to go. The road narrowed as she approached the forest. Trees loomed high on either side, casting long shadows over the gravel. She parked where the pavement ended and continued on foot. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her phone screen showed the coordinates, the blinking blue dot moving closer to the marked point. The silence was dense, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. When she reached the spot, she stopped. There was nothing remarkable there. No sign, no structure. Just moss-covered ground and tangled roots. She turned in a slow circle, trying to shake the unease, and then she saw it. A tree older than the others, with bark weathered and cracked. Carved into its trunk, faint but visible, was the letter A. She stood still, barely breathing. Was it a coincidence, a tribute, a remnant of something long buried? The mark looked old but not ancient. Someone had been there, someone who remembered. And now Eli had led her to it, without ever knowing her or the girl who vanished. Back in her car, her hands trembled as she placed the phone down. The forest felt different now, not sinister, but solemn, like a place where something sacred had once been lost. When she returned to school on Monday, she tried to focus on her routine, but Eli sensed something had changed. He looked at her, then quietly slid a new sheet of paper onto her desk. More numbers, another sequence. She hesitated. She had promised herself she wouldn't go deeper, but how could she stop now? With every new set of coordinates, the mystery thickened, and Eli remained eerily calm, as if he were simply delivering a message written somewhere far beyond his understanding. How many more places would he uncover? And what stories were waiting beneath the surface, just quiet enough to be forgotten until now? The pattern was no longer ignorable. Miss Lorne kept every sheet Eli handed her, organizing them carefully in a locked drawer. Each new sequence led to a location, some familiar, others obscure, but they all shared one thing: a history of silence. of people who disappeared, of stories that ended too soon and without closure. She reached out to a local journalist, someone she trusted from years back, Clara Voss. Clara had covered many of the region's forgotten cases and knew the difference between rumor and fact. When Miss Lorne showed her the coordinates and the corresponding stories, Clara's skepticism faded into unease. The matches were undeniable. Places connected to real people, real families, real grief. Clara began cross-referencing the data with public archives. Every coordinate aligned with a story, some from decades ago, some never made public beyond whispers. A missing child, a hiker never found, a woman who left work and never came home. The eerie precision with which Eli pointed to each site was impossible to dismiss. Meanwhile, Eli continued his quiet routine. He never asked about the numbers, never showed curiosity about where they led. He would simply hand Miss Lorne a folded paper every few days, then return to his seat and gaze out the window. His calm was unsettling, not in a sinister way, but in the way that made adults feel like children in the face of something they couldn't explain. Miss Lorne and Clara kept their findings private. They feared the consequences of public exposure. What would people say? What would happen to Eli? But the weight of the knowledge grew heavier by the day. They tried to ask him, gently, without pressure, how he came up with the numbers. He gave the same answer each time. I see them before I wake up. No fear, no embellishment, just a simple truth, delivered like a fact of nature. One evening, Clara called Miss Lorne. She had followed one of the most recent coordinates and found something unusual. An object buried shallowly beneath the soil, wrapped in plastic. Nothing harmful, just a child's toy, one that matched the description from an old missing person report. It was small, but enough to shake them both. These weren't just numbers, they were memories, echoes, clues from somewhere or someone still trying to be found. And if Eli was the one receiving them, who or what was sending them? Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the unfolding mystery began to change Miss Lorne. She wasn't sleeping well. Her thoughts constantly returned to the pages Eli handed her, to the places they marked on the map, and to the hollow silence surrounding each story. Clara had become her closest confidant. Together they mapped out every coordinate, traced every missing name, and kept asking the same question neither could answer. Why Eli? One morning, Eli arrived earlier than usual. He walked straight to Miss Lorne's desk and left a small notebook instead of a loose sheet. The cover was plain, worn at the edges, and his name wasn't written on it. She waited until the students had left for recess before opening it. Inside, page after page of tightly written numbers. But now, something new. Doodles, small sketches in the margins, a tree, a road, a bridge, a building that looked like an old bus stop. Each image positioned next to a set of coordinates, as if trying to say more, as if the numbers were only part of the message. That evening, she shared the notebook with Clara. They recognized one of the sketches immediately, a park bench near the river, once the site of a disappearance that had haunted the town in the late 90s. A teenage boy had vanished on his way home. The case had never been connected to anything, until now. Together, they visited the site. There was nothing visibly unusual, just weathered wood and fading graffiti. But nearby, under a layer of dry leaves, Clara found something glinting faintly. A keychain, rusted but still intact. The initials on it matched the boy's name. Another whisper from the past surfaced not by investigation, but through Eli's silent hand. They didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. Something or someone was clearly reaching out, but through a child, a boy who barely spoke, who seemed unaffected by the consequences of what he was revealing. And the deeper they looked, the more Eli seemed to drift inward, as if each message he passed along took something from him. He smiled less, spoke less, and yet he continued to write. If this was a burden, why was he carrying it so quietly? And how much longer could he hold it before something changed forever? It was around this time that Miss Lorne realized she was no longer simply a teacher. She had become something else entirely, an intermediary, a guardian of secrets too heavy for a 10-year-old to carry alone. Clara suggested they take the findings to someone higher up, perhaps an investigator, willing to look beyond conventional explanations. But Miss Lorne hesitated. Once Eli's name entered official channels, they would lose control of the story. And what would that do to him? Still, the notebook grew thicker. Eli had filled another, this time including dates next to some of the coordinates, past dates, specific days that matched the disappearances they had been mapping. The level of detail was growing, as if Eli wasn't just writing numbers anymore, he was remembering events or reliving them. Clara contacted a retired detective, someone she'd interviewed years before. He agreed to meet in private, to look over the data without judgment. He sat for nearly 2 hours, flipping through pages, cross-checking places with cases long buried in silence. When he looked up, his face was pale. He told them this wasn't coincidence. He had seen patterns before, but nothing like this. The level of accuracy, distances, environmental details, even timing, was beyond chance. He asked where the information came from. Miss Lorne paused, then simply said, "A student." The detective didn't laugh. He didn't question. Instead, he looked at the notebook again and said something that chilled her. If he's right, then this isn't over. That night, Miss Lorne found herself staring at Eli during class. He was drawing again, this time something more elaborate, a train crossing. She recognized it immediately. It had been the last place seen by a woman who vanished 2 towns over. That case had no connection to the others. Until now. And just as the bell rang and the students began to leave, Eli turned to her and whispered something for the first time since all this began. "They're still out there." Miss Lorne froze. She didn't know what "they" meant. Memories, voices, souls. But Eli didn't explain. He simply walked out of the room, his steps light, as if a weight had been lifted or transferred. Whatever this was, it was far from finished. And the next number was already waiting. The next paper arrived folded neatly in half, placed silently on Miss Lorne's desk the following morning. Eli didn't wait for acknowledgement. He walked to his seat, opened a blank notebook, and stared out the window as if already listening for the next message. But this one was different. The numbers were familiar, but now accompanied by what looked like names, initials, possibly even ages. Miss Lorne brought the paper to Clara that afternoon. Together, they reviewed it line by line, cross-checking each combination. To their growing unease, the information seemed to match several lesser-known reports of missing persons, not high-profile cases, not the kind that made headlines, just people who had vanished without fanfare, without answers, without anyone connecting the dots. And now, a boy who had never met them was writing them down. Clara suggested they begin documenting everything formally. She created a secure digital folder, storing every scan, every coordinate, every drawing. The map was expanding. The weight of what they were building no longer felt like a quiet discovery. It felt like a responsibility. But something else was shifting. Eli's demeanor had changed. He wasn't just quiet, he was distant, tired. His eyes no longer wandered. They fixated. He would stare at corners of the room for minutes, unmoving, as if listening. And when asked about his drawings or numbers, he offered no response. He seemed neither afraid nor confused, only detached. One afternoon, Clara arrived with news. Another object had been found at one of the locations. A broken necklace buried shallowly beneath an overgrown path. Its pendant matched one seen in an old photo from a case in 2003. The match wasn't public. It wasn't documented anywhere online. The only people who had seen it were the family and the original case files. There was no way Eli could have known, unless he was being shown. That evening, Miss Lorne sat alone in her classroom, the lights dimmed, the sky outside turning grey. She spread out every page Eli had given her. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, the fear, the awe, the helplessness. Because if the boy truly was a conduit, then the question no longer was how he knew. It was why now, and what would happen when the next name appeared. Miss Lorne began keeping the classroom door open during her free periods. Part of her hoped someone would walk in and tell her what to do, but no one did. Outside, the world continued moving, students laughing in hallways, bells ringing, life unfolding with routine. Inside, however, something extraordinary was unraveling in silence, page by page, name by name. Eli, once simply quiet, now radiated a stillness that unnerved even the most observant. He didn't fidget, he didn't daydream, he simply existed, calm, deliberate, as if waiting for something only he could feel coming closer. And then one morning, he stopped writing. No notebook, no folded paper. He sat at his desk, hands folded, eyes distant. Miss Lorne approached him gently, asking if everything was okay. He looked at her and said, "It's almost finished." That was all. Clara arrived at lunch with new findings. A map she'd generated based on the coordinates revealed something terrifyingly elegant. A geometric pattern. Not random dots, but lines, triangles, shapes that connected one site to the next, forming a constellation of stories once thought unrelated. The message was clearer now. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were fragments of a larger truth. That same day, Clara received an anonymous email. No text, just a photo. An aerial image of the area surrounding the forest where Ava had disappeared, marked with 3 X's. None of them had been published. It was an old file, likely leaked, and one of the X's matched the very tree Miss Lorne had visited, the one with the carved initial. Whoever sent it knew. Later that afternoon, Miss Lorne checked her drawer. A small envelope had been placed there. No one had seen Eli leave it. Inside, a single sheet, but instead of numbers, it held a message written in Eli's childlike handwriting. "They're listening now." It wasn't clear who they were. The souls of the lost? The ones responsible? Or something else entirely? But the weight of the phrase hit Miss Lorne like a whisper in an empty room. That night, she and Clara sat in silence, rereading every message, every sketch. They realized the pattern was complete. The coordinates had formed a closed loop, a circle of memory, of loss, of something unfinished but no longer hidden. What had begun as a single strange doodle now felt like a call, not for justice, but for remembrance, and tomorrow the final page would be turned. The final page came without warning. It was a Tuesday morning, grey and quiet, with rain pressing softly against the windows. Eli walked into the classroom as usual, his steps slow but certain. He didn't carry a backpack that day, only a small, worn notebook tucked under his arm. He placed it on Miss Lorne's desk without a word, then sat down and stared ahead. Miss Lorne opened it after the last bell. Inside, 10 pages, each one containing a sequence of numbers she had never seen before. But something was different. These didn't point to places. They were dates, specific moments in time. Some had already passed. Some were still to come. Clara rushed to the school as soon as she heard. Together, they began cross-referencing the dates. One coincided with Ava's disappearance, another with the day the retired detective had investigated a property linked to another case. One date, weeks away, was circled in red. "What's going to happen then?" Clara whispered, but no answer came. Not from Eli, not from anywhere. That afternoon, Miss Lorne sat beside Eli after the other students had gone. She asked him softly, "Do you know what these dates mean?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. They're moments that echo, where something lost comes close again. It wasn't a definition, it wasn't science, but somehow it made sense. These were moments where silence thinned, where memory tried to resurface. Eli wasn't predicting, he was pointing again. The final date circled in red fell on a Friday. On that day, Miss Lorne and Clara went to the final marked location. An open field near the edge of town, long forgotten. There, under a mound of fallen leaves, they found a small wooden box. Inside, old photographs, faded letters, a journal with pages missing. The name written on the inside cover was Ava's. It wasn't closure, it wasn't an answer, but it was something. Eli never wrote again after that. He still came to school, still sat by the window, but the numbers stopped. The silence that had once guided his pencil had faded, as if it had finally said all it needed to say. Miss Lorne kept the notebook in a drawer she never opened, because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some are meant to be carried, and some only speak to those willing to listen. If you felt the weight of this story, subscribe to the channel and explore the others we've uncovered. And tell us, do you believe Eli was remembering something, or was he being remembered by something else?